Section 3 of George Castriot, surnamed Scanderbeg, King of Albania, Books 1 through 3, by Marin Barleti and Jacques de Lavardin. Translated by Zachary Jones and Clement Clark Moore. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Book 2, Part 1. When Amurath became acquainted with the particulars of all the disasters which Skanderbeg had brought upon him, it is said he at first was so overcome as to remain for a time without uttering a word. But his feelings at length burst forth in violent exclamations, complaints, and threatenings, tidings continuing to arrive from different parts of Epire, and the successes of Skanderbeg, how that Croia was taken by him, and that he had obtained possession of other important places, the garrisons of which were slain and dispersed, and that, in fine, the whole estate of his ancestors was recovered by him with incredible favour and goodwill of the nations. The grief and vexation of Amurath was still more exasperated. Still he resolved, setting aside all other things, to bend his thoughts towards the war with Hungary. The opinions of Amurath's counsellors were divided in regard to the course to be pursued. Some were for bending at once the Ottoman's strength against Skanderbeg, that he might be crushed before his power should be established. Others again were in favour of prosecuting the war with Hungary, without suffering it to be interrupted by the revolt of Skanderbeg. Amurath finally agreed with the Hungarians upon a truce for 10 years, with other conditions which it is unnecessary here to mention. He did not, however, immediately proceed to take vengeance of Skanderbeg, but suffered the winter and spring following, and part of the summer, to pass over before he aroused himself. Skanderbeg, having taken leave of Moses, returned from Dibra to Croia, where he passed the greater part of the winter in attending to the affairs of the state and to individual concerns. Upon the approach of spring he took with him a Mesa and a few horse, and went forth to levy forces, and having mustered 6,000 men, he went direct towards Svettograd. But this demonstration proved of no avail. Neither the difficulty of the siege nor the obstinacy of the defenders was diminished. Neither threats nor promises could avail anything. He was without artillery, and even if he had been supplied therewith, it is not probable that it would have enabled him to reduce the place, and it appeared to be a course of great imprudence and temerity to make an attempt which threatened not only the certain peril of his forces, but their probable ruin and destruction. Wherefore, in accordance with the opinion of the majority, he for the present abandoned the proposed attempt upon Svettograd, and resolved to turn his arms elsewhere. But, before departing, he proceeded to lay waste to the environs of the town, in order to distress the inhabitants thereof. It is, however, reported that some of them came secretly to Skanderbeg, and entreated him that, in regard of their past services to John his father, he would not utterly destroy everything, by which proceeding he would do more harm to them than to the Turks, and that these and other motives which were urged induced him to grant their request, seeing he had no reason to doubt the faith of men who were Christians, and who had been the subjects of his ancestors. There was a country called Mokria in the vicinity of the dominions of Skanderbeg, which was exceedingly pleasant and well peopled, and containing many large towns and boroughs. Towards this country Skanderbeg led his army, and, taking possession of it, added it to his dominions, thus extending beyond the bounds of his father's empire. There was not an enemy to be found in all the country, for the Turks, before that, had either been expelled or voluntarily retired from those parts, and the inhabitants, of their own accord, enrolled themselves in the service of Skanderbeg, and marched under his ensigns and the eagles in time past well known to them. Footnote: for in his standards, which were gules, he bore an eagle with 2 heads sable, these being the ancient arms of his family. Translation of Lavardin. Footnote end. Passing on from Mochria, sometimes showing himself gentle and lenient, and at others severe and terrible, he daily added to his conquests, and thus increased the extent and richness of his dominions, at the same time continually taking order for one thing or other, appointing guards for the passages, and providing for the garrisons. He frequently visited Croia, and examined all other places of importance, being seldom idle or quiet, but riding to and fro, he made himself acquainted with the mountains, hills, forests, thickets, caves, dens, and secret lurking places. All which care was with the view of rendering himself more able to defend the country against the expected invasion of the Turks. The little leisure which he had was employed in making inroads into the territory of his enemies. He avoided nothing more than to suffer his men to be corrupted by idleness, having continually in his mouth this saying of Fabius Maximus, that it was not good for an army to continue long in one place, but that frequent change of their place and camp was far preferable, and would much better fit them for military service. These things could not fail to reach the ears of Amurath. Messengers came to him from Phasalia and other parts of Macedonia, filling his palace with clamour and outcries. It was reported that Skanderbeg had gotten possession of many places, and was daily pursuing his conquests with his wonted fierceness and severity, that both one and the other Dibria had voluntarily surrendered themselves to him, killing with their own hands the Turkish garrisons, or delivering them up prisoners to their new lord. These marches of Upper and Lower Dibria of old appertained to John Castriot, who had been constrained to yield them to Amurath. Those who brought these accounts to Amurath set forth that, in consequence of the revolt of the Dibrians, the Christians would soon be the masters of Svetrograd, being seated in Upper Dibria, and consequently unable to procure supplies from the surrounding country, that Mochria and other places which were not of the domain of John Castriot had declared for Skanderbeg. By all these accounts, Amurath was of necessity stirred up to arms. After having assembled his council, and fully deliberated upon the state of affairs, he gave orders that a powerful army should be levied, by which he thought to extinguish the name of Skanderbeg, and avenge himself for the revolt of the Albanians, and the many injuries which he conceived himself to have suffered from them. Skanderbeg also, on his part, was certified of the designs of the Turk, not only through persons unknown to him, but also by some of his friends, of whom he still had many about Amurath. Being wonderfully bold in exposing himself to all sorts of danger, he at the same time discovered singular prudence and wisdom in all his conduct, for as he foresaw that he should have to maintain a very severe struggle in the defence of his dominions, into the heart of which the war would probably be brought, and that his own resources might be insufficient to carry him through the contest which awaited him, he determined to seek the aid and alliance of the neighbouring princes and nobles. In order to facilitate this object, he deemed it most advisable to invite them to a conference in some convenient place. He accordingly chose a town appertaining to the Venetian dominion, named Lissa or Alesia, distant somewhat more than 22 miles from Croia. This place was thought suitable, not only on account of the convenience of its situation, but because the government of the Venetians was generally liked for its mild and gentle character. Those who were invited showed no backwardness or delay, for none refused to attend the conference, and all exhibited the greatest alacrity and zeal in the cause of Skanderbeg. The princes and nobles being assembled in the great church of Lissa, Skanderbeg addressed a speech to them, which it is said was much approved and highly applauded by the assembly. He was unanimously chosen the commander-in-chief of the armies, and to his sole direction was committed the conduct of the war. He was esteemed most worthy of the honour bestowed upon him on account of his skill and science in military affairs, his great prudence and deliberation, his long acquaintance with the manners and customs of the barbarians, and his wonderful judgment, which was confirmed by long use and daily experience. For all these considerations, an assured hope of success was entertained by those who displayed this confidence in him. His allies all voluntarily taxed themselves for the support of the war, except the Venetians, who would not bind themselves to pay a stated subsidy, but promised to be ready at all times to afford any aid which might be required. After the business of the assembly was concluded, and prayers had been offered up and processions made for the strengthening of the league, Skanderbeg was by some accompanied to Croia, and the rest betook themselves to their own homes. The city of Czwittinger had been so closely pressed by Moses that it had surrendered to him, and he and his troops had been recalled, except those with which he garrisoned the place, and a few who were left upon the mountains in order to maintain a careful lookout. The troops thus recalled did not amount to more than 5,000 men, as Skanderbeg had previously licensed many to depart. But commissions were now made out, and officers appointed, and dispatched to various parts in order to levy forces. During these transactions in Epire, it must not be supposed that Amurath remained at ease, and unoccupied with the care of the war against Skanderbeg, upon which he had resolved. He caused an army of 40,000 men to be raised, and committed the command to Halid Pasha, a leader of tried valour in action, and of approved wisdom in council, and who, by his merit, had risen to great military honour, whose high reputation, as well as that of his troops, inspired the Turks with full assurance of an easy triumph over the Albanians, and caused among them as much appearance of exultation as though Skanderbeg were already taken prisoner, and was going to execution. With respect to the inhabitants of Epire, they were much alarmed by the rumour of the Turkish preparations. The country people, driving their cattle before them, betook themselves to the walled cities for protection, and the townspeople strengthened their fortifications and stationed guards, as though the enemy was close at hand. The aged men and the women encouraged those who could bear arms to exert themselves in their defence, and offered up prayers and vows to heaven for the preservation of their country. As to Skanderbeg, he was not at all moved by any of these things, neither by the prospect of a Turkish invasion, nor by the greatness of the enemy's preparations, nor by the terror of his own subjects, but made light of the threats of Amurath, and derided the fears which they excited. He nevertheless put everything in readiness throughout his dominions for the reception of the enemy, and so encouraged and inflamed the hearts of his soldiers that they wished for nothing more ardently than for the approach of the enemy. It is supposed that he had information of all Amurath's designs by means of secret friends at the Turkish court. Having ordered everything for the safety of his country, he began to levy an army at Croia. Most of his subjects of Epirus, who were capable of bearing arms, then repaired to him. The confederate Christian princes also, his neighbours, many of whom were his kinsmen, furnished him with great supplies. Other devout and warlike Christians also resorted to him from far in great numbers. Out of this multitude, which might have afforded him a very large army, he selected 8,000 horsemen and 7,000 foot. The remainder, with the exception of such as he placed in certain frontier garrisons, he licensed to depart home again. It was a matter of great wonder to both the friends and foes of Skanderbeg that he should take the field with so few forces, when he might have had so much larger an army under his command. But Skanderbeg himself was wont to say that the quality of an army was more to be depended upon than the size of it, as will be noted hereafter. Before commencing his march with this small army of 15,000 men, Skanderbeg addressed his men in an animated speech, by which he stirred them up to an ardent desire for the combat. And then, having given orders for their pay, and divine service having been devoutly celebrated, he proceeded to the lower Dibra, and encamped towards sundown about 80 miles from Croia. near to a mountain full of woods, or rather to a forest of lofty trees directly in the way which it would be necessary for the Pasha to take, of whose approach he had received notice by means of his espials. Within this wood he placed Musak and Amisa with 3,000 horsemen in ambush, and gave them orders to lie close until they should see him completely engaged in battle with the Turks, and then rush with their utmost force upon the rear of the enemy. Scarcely had Skanderbeg placed his men in ambush before the Turkish forces made their appearance, and the Pasha came and encamped near to the Albanians a little before the setting of the sun, and remained there that night. Many fires were kindled in his camp, and sounds of great mirth and joy were heard. Skanderbeg, on the contrary, ordered all to be silent, and no fires to be lighted in his camp, and directed those who were not wanted on guard to take their rest, whereby he rendered the Turks less vigilant, as they supposed him to be intimidated and discouraged. During the night the Turks approached his camp, and used insulting language towards his soldiers, but he commanded all to remain quiet, and take no notice of the barbarians. When the moon rose, he first caused his troops to take refreshment, and he then drew them out, and, that he might obtain some knowledge of the strength and order of the enemy, directed his horsemen to engage in light skirmishes with the Turks. He then in the morning arranged his army in the following order. On the left wing he placed Tanusi, with 1,500 horse and the like number of foot. In front of the cavalry he intermingled a number of archers on foot, that the battle might be begun by them, and that the rest of the infantry might be able to come speedily to the charge, and to retire if hard pressed, notwithstanding the engagement of the horsemen. Moses, who commanded the right wing, composed of Dibrians, ordered his battle in the same manner, but in what manner soever the Dibrians might be arranged, and whether foot or horse, they were sure of performing their duty, and seldom failed of being victorious. Between the wings were arranged the remainder of the forces, bending inward in form of a crescent, commanded by Skanderbeg himself. 1,000 horse were likewise in the front of his division, for, as the forces of the enemy were devoid of infantry, it was not deemed advisable to expose his troops to the first fury of the onset of the enemy's cavalry. Next to these 1,000 horsemen were placed nearly a like number of archers on foot, who were well trained and skilled to accompany the horse and shelter themselves under their sides, by which means they were able both to guard themselves and to annoy the enemy, who were not aware of any such mode of attack. George Castriot, a valiant knight, was also there, accompanied and surrounded by the soldiers and youth of Croia, having so disposed them that he might be able to encourage them by his example, and to witness their conduct. Footnote: I cannot understand the precise place assigned by Lavardin to these troops. Footnote end. After the squadron of archers followed the main body of the infantry, composed of bands armed with pikes and targets, led on by Idin, the brother of Musak. Uranocontes, a sage and experienced warrior, commanded the rest of the horse with the rearward and reserve. This was a strong and close battalion, composed of the flower of the old soldiers, holding themselves firm, like a bulwark, for the support of the other troops. When Skanderbeg had thus marshalled his army, he would not permit the trumpet to give the signal for battle until he saw the Pasha ready and advancing to the fight. He feared lest the impetuosity of his men should cause them to rush forward and break their ranks, and thus fall into confusion. The Turkish commander, looking upon the arrangement of the Christian forces, advanced, uttering contemptuous speeches. "Ever, ever," said he, "do the greater devour the less." And he laughed outright at what he called the foolish pomp of the Christians, marching so formally and foolishly, as he thought, to their own funeral. One of the Ottoman legions came forward boldly before the others, but being speedily and closely charged by the forlorn hope of the Christians, they suddenly gave way, and retreated quickly within their trenches, but the Prince of Albania, suspecting some Turkish stratagem, sent forward a body of horsemen to stay the furious pursuit of his own soldiers, and to bring every man back into his place. The same thing occurred in the left wing, and, when all were again in their places, they prepared themselves for a general engagement. When the fight began, the wings were fiercely led on by Tanusi and Moses, and Castriot, with like fury pricking forward cheerfully with his cavalry, assailed the battalion of the enemy which he had selected. The ambush also broke forth from the woods with loud cries and shouts before the forces of the Pasha had all joined battle, whereupon many companies of the Turks, particularly those in the rearward, betook themselves to flight, and thus the front ranks being hemmed in by the wings of the Christian army were exposed to be slaughtered by the centre legion. One battalion of the enemy for a long time kept the event of the engagement doubtful. This battalion was composed of the flower of the army, and, as was afterwards known, surrounded the general Ali Pasha. Aydin, who commanded the main body of infantry, having charged the Turkish centre, was met by a determined resistance on the part of the enemy, who continued to pour in new forces until Uranicontes, with the reserve, fresh and in high spirits, fell upon them and decided the battle. Few of the enemy in this part of the conflict escaped the swords of the Christians, except 300, who, begging for quarter and casting away their arms, were spared by order of the Christian prince. The troops, after their success and worthy exploits, came with loud acclamations into the presence of their commander, where they found all things as they could wish, for the Croyans had entirely broken the battalion of the Pasha, and, after a dreadful slaughter, they pursued the Turkish commander, who saved himself with the relics of his army. The fight continued from sunrise until 9 o'clock, the third hour. 24 ensigns of the Turks were taken, 2,000 of the enemy made prisoners, and 22,000 slain. The loss of the Christians was very small. It is said there were missing but about 120, though the number of the wounded was much greater. In this severe battle, nothing was omitted or overlooked on the part of the Christians that might tend to victory. With regard to both officers and soldiers, it has been affirmed that lions were led on by lions. Many of them were old soldiers who had borne arms under the father of Skanderbeg, and appeared to be masters in the art of war. Skanderbeg remained quiet in his camp the remainder of that day and the following night. The next morning, elated with the success of his arms, he prepared to make an incursion into the territories of the enemy. Having joyfully addressed his troops, he directed that the foot soldiers should mount the horses that were taken from the enemy, and that all should serve on horseback, as men-at-arms, and he invited every man under the favour of the great God to follow him cheerfully and reap the fruits of their valour. The soldiers most gladly accepted this invitation, and, through contempt of the enemy, were for hurrying on without order or precaution. But the prince, not trusting the fickleness of fortune, restrained the eagerness of his men until such a time as the scouts whom he had sent out brought him word that there was no danger. Great was the booty which they obtained. Men and cattle were driven away, and nothing spared but the women and children. Even the wounded soldiers took part in the pillage, and so abundant was the spoil that the men seemed more grieved at what they were obliged to leave behind them than rejoiced at what they could carry away. At length Castriot ordered a retreat to be sounded, and his men retired, overloaded with booty. The captains made themselves merry with the common soldiers, calling them sheep-stealers and shepherds, and asking what Ali Pasha, if he were now to see them, would say to his soldiers for having been conquered by such a set of fellows. Thus the soldiers, with mirth and merriment, and joyful songs, dragged on their loads, until, with loud cries, they saluted the guards of their camp, who joined, and marched on before them. Having passed the following night in camp, Skanderbeg, the next morning, ordered the baggage to be trussed up, and, with his host, marched on triumphant towards Croia. The multitudes which encountered them on their way saluted them as valiant and triumphant, and wondered at the spoil taken from the enemy. The newly made men-at-arms could scarcely be distinguished from the old. These congratulations and rejoicings continued many days. Letters crowned with laurel were sent to the princes and lords of Epire, together with some of the standards taken in battle, the remainder of which were hung up in the churches. End of section 3.